Welcome to JW Broadcasting for June 2023. Over the past few years, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Gilead classes were limited to 24 students. Now, on the 80th anniversary of the school, 48 special full-time servants from around the world were once again together in one class. On March 11th, a program of specifically crafted talks was presented as a parting gift to the graduates. It's our pleasure to share these talks with you. Here is part one of the 153rd Gilead Graduation Program.
O would some power the gift give us, to see ourselves as others see us. It would from many a blunder free us. Well, that famous quote from the Scottish poet Robert Burns acknowledges that it is impossible always to see ourselves as others do. Well, that's why we need training. That's why we need advice. That's why we need counsel to help us to improve and to work on certain flaws that perhaps we just can't see in ourselves. Well, what a wonderful opportunity you students at Gilead have had to receive focused spiritual training from brothers who truly love you. And now, no doubt, you've come to see yourself more clearly than you have ever seen yourself before. But you know, that quote from Robert Burns can be understood in a different way, too. See, maybe what we cannot see clearly in ourselves are all of the good qualities that we possess, or the potential that we have to be used by Jehovah in his service. 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7 says, "Man sees what appears to the eyes, but Jehovah sees into the heart." Well, in seeing into your heart, Jehovah saw fit to draw you into a dedicated relationship with him. And since then, he's entrusted you with various assignments in his service. Now, why? Why did Jehovah do that? What does he see in you? What qualities, what spiritual qualifications does he observe? Well, we can't know all that Jehovah sees in you because we cannot see ourselves as Jehovah sees us. That's probably why so many of God's servants in Bible times were reluctant to accept challenging assignments. Now, just think of some examples of this. People who did not see the fine qualities in themselves that Jehovah could see. For example, take Gideon. Now, in Judges chapter 6, let's look at this. Judges chapter 6 and verse 14. Notice what Jehovah said to Gideon. He said, "Go with the strength you have, and you will save Israel out of Midian's hand. Is it not I who send you?" But now how did Gideon react? Verse 15. Gideon said, "Pardon me, Jehovah, how can I save Israel? Look, my clan is the least in Manasseh, and I am the most insignificant in my father's house." Well, obviously, Gideon could not see himself as Jehovah saw him. What about Moses? In Exodus chapter 4, when Jehovah assigned him to lead Israel out of Egypt, Moses was keenly aware of all of his inadequacies. In fact, when talking with Jehovah, he raised one objection after another. Well, was Jehovah aware of the inadequacies that Moses had? Of course he was. He also knew that Moses' brother Aaron was older and that he was a better speaker. But Jehovah saw in Moses qualities of faith, unselfishness, and meekness, qualities that made Moses the right choice for the job. What about Jeremiah? When Jehovah commissioned him to serve as a prophet, do you remember what he said? Let's look at it. Jeremiah chapter 1. Jeremiah chapter 1. Look at verse 6. Jeremiah says, "Alas, O sovereign Lord Jehovah, I do not know how to speak, for I am just a boy." Well, what did Jehovah say? Oh, okay, Jeremiah, I'll see if I can find someone else. No. Look at verse 7. Jehovah then said to me, "Do not say I am but a boy, for you must go to all those to whom I send you, and you should say everything that I command you." Why was Jehovah so confident that Jeremiah was the right choice for this special assignment? Well, of course, if you look at verse 8, Jehovah says, "I am with you." Now, of course, that's the same thing that Jehovah said to Gideon. It's the same thing he said to Moses. In other words, because Jehovah was with them, they would be successful. But there's another reason too. Do you see what it says in verse 5? Jehovah says to Jeremiah, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew," isn't that interesting? "I knew you. And before you were born, I sanctified you. I made you a prophet to the nations." Jehovah knew Jeremiah. He saw in Jeremiah certain qualities that would make him an effective prophet with Jehovah's help. Well, could Jeremiah see that in himself? No. He just had to trust in Jehovah's assessment, move forward, and do what Jehovah asked him to do. Well, we have wonderful examples of this in our modern day too. Brother John Booth was a faithful, humble brother. He started in full-time service in 1928. Now, in 1935, he was called to work at the factory at Bethel. But now, just after working for a few days, he was very surprised when Brother Knorr invited him to go on the road as a regional service director, what we would perhaps call a circuit overseer today. Brother Knorr explained there was a great need and that Brother Booth could be a big help because of his experience as a pioneer. But Brother Booth replied that he had never had a position in the congregation. He had never given a talk, can you imagine? And he had no training to do so. But here's what Brother Knorr said. Eloquent speakers are not what is needed. Just someone who loves the service and will take the lead in it and will talk about service at the meetings. Brother Booth said, with misgivings, doubts, and fears, but wanting to do Jehovah's will, I agreed to try it. Well, how did it turn out? Brother Booth moved forward. He spent his whole life in full-time service, later serving for more than 20 years as a member of the governing body. When he finished his earthly course, the Watchtower stated, he was beloved for his profoundly humble and kind Christian personality. Obviously, Jehovah saw something good in Brother John Booth. Well, what do we learn from these examples? Like Gideon and Moses and Jeremiah and Brother Booth, we might feel inadequate for certain assignments. And it's good that we're not overconfident or too self-reliant. Yet we don't want to go to the other extreme either. If so, you see, we could begin to think, I could never be a pioneer. I could never be a ministerial servant. I could never be an elder. I could never be a Bethelite. I could never be a construction servant, and on and on and on. If we're given one of those assignments or some other one, we could even hesitate to accept, give in to fear. But the fact is that we cannot fully see ourselves as Jehovah does. how much better to make ourselves available and then move forward with the work that we're given to do, looking to Jehovah to make up for whatever we may lack. Well, now you students, who are soon to be graduates, will no doubt have a variety of assignments in the coming years. Whatever those assignments are, move forward with full confidence in Jehovah. Jehovah will be with you. He'll give you everything that you need to be successful in accomplishing the work. So here's the question. Can you see yourself as Jehovah sees you? Well, perhaps to some extent, yes, but not completely. So be ready to listen to counsel and to make adjustments. But also, when your good qualities and your good potential are noticed and you receive new assignments, grab hold and move forward. And may our wonderful God, Jehovah, always be with you and bless you as you do so. Well, now we're looking forward to the first talk of our Gilead graduation program. It's going to be from a member of the United States Branch Committee, Brother Jesse Morris, and his theme is, "What will you be called?"
The greatest honor anyone can have is to be called a servant of the Most High God, Jehovah. And as you've seen from your deep study of God's Word, servants of Jehovah also have distinct personality traits and qualities that are called to mind when their names are mentioned. For example, what qualities or traits do you think of when we mention the following names? Ruth, Gideon, David, Martha. Yes, the name of a servant of Jehovah can call to mind certain qualities, certain traits that are worthy of imitation. So, what will you be called? As you begin your new assignment, what quality or trait would you like your fellow workers to think about when your name is mentioned? The Bible book of Proverbs provides a very reachable goal in this regard. Please open to Proverbs chapter 16, and we'll read together verse 21. That's Proverbs chapter 16, verse 21. The wise in heart will be called understanding. What a worthy goal that is, to be called a person of understanding. Now, from your studies, you know understanding, it's the ability to put the facts together, grasp the full, complete picture of a matter. So how is understanding demonstrated? Is it revealed in a test score? Or is it revealed by being the first to provide a solution in a group setting, or perhaps at a meeting? Well, let's keep reading verse 21. And the one kind in speech adds persuasiveness. There's how understanding is demonstrated, in kind speech, or as the footnote indicates, appealing speech, sweetness of lips. So a person who's called understanding puts the facts together, grasps the full picture in order to find good in a matter. And that is reflected through kind, positive, persuasive speech. Now, this is more than just being optimistic or the power of positive thinking. Understanding has a source. Please turn to Proverbs, this time chapter 9, and we'll read verse 10. That's Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. The fear of Jehovah is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Most Holy One is understanding. There is the source, the most holy one, Jehovah God. He's both the source of understanding and he's the supreme example in how to use it. Just think for a moment of what happened after the tragic, painful rebellion in the Garden of Eden. What did Jehovah do? Immediately, he put the facts together. He saw the complete picture. And then he uttered the Edenic promise, a positive promise that gives us hope, even right after that painful tragedy. And hundreds of years later, with the nation of Israel, they would repeatedly abandon Jehovah. What would he do? He would hear their groanings. He would hear their cries. He would see their changed attitude, and he would raise up judges to save them time after time. Yes, Jehovah God shows us what real understanding is. And because we trust in him, we too can find the good, speak and act kindly and positively. And how refreshing it is to see this in your class. Your kind, positive speech and actions with one another and with those that you come in contact with has been very refreshing to see. It's a result of your deep trust in God's word and your deep trust in Jehovah himself. And your studies have just further enhanced that over these past few months. In contrast, much of the world's education fosters critical thinking. And note what the Watchtower says about this. We quote, "Do not be fooled by the mistaken notion that a cynical, critical, pessimistic attitude is the same as intelligence. Actually, negative thinking demands little of the intellect." So what a privilege to know, as you, dear students, do, what real understanding is. It's not just the ability to identify what's wrong with a situation. It's the ability to identify how good can address it. And this will encourage your brothers and sisters. One Bethel family member observed understanding in the assistant overseer of a department. On one occasion, the department overseer scheduled a meeting with several brothers from other departments, but he forgot to inform his assistant. Then on the day of the meeting, the overseer was away. So several brothers arrived for a meeting that the assistant knew nothing about. What would he do? It was observed he said a brief silent prayer, came out, welcomed the group, addressed the points for discussion, and at the end said, "Thank you, brothers, for coming to this meeting and allowing me to fill in for the overseer. And I'll update him when he returns." It just covered for him. Beautiful example. He knew this man had shouldered responsibility for decades. This was not his pattern. So he just applied good. He showed understanding. Now, realistically, there will be days when it will be hard to be known as a person of understanding. What if, though, there's a prolonged period of time where we're finding it difficult to find the good, to speak and act kindly and positively? Maybe our mate or a trusted friend even speaks with us and says, your kind, positive speech and actions are changing. What can we do? Well, each person and their relationship with Jehovah is unique. But let's consider the example of the writer of Psalm 73 and learn a valuable principle. The writer of this inspired psalm was struggling with even whether or not to serve Jehovah. Note the turmoil he's in at Psalm 73, verse 14. "And I was troubled all day long. Every morning I was chastised." Now, it can be difficult to be known as a person of understanding when we're in this frame of mind. In fact, in verse 22, the psalmist honestly admits, "I was unreasoning and lacked understanding." So what would he do? Could he ever be called understanding again? Notice verse 15. "But if I had said these things, I would have betrayed your people." So first, the psalmist held back from making his perplexing thoughts public. He knew that that kind of negative speech would affect God's people, he likened it to a betrayal, as if he were releasing the names of his fellow worshipers to the enemy. That's what he likened negative speech to. Instead, he kept to his spiritual routine and waited. And then a powerful moment took place in verse 26. My body and my heart may fail, but God is the rock of my heart and my portion forever. There it is. Understanding. The psalmist knew he was not alone. Jehovah God, the immovable rock, was keeping him stable in the midst of this violent windstorm that he found himself in. That powerful realization plugged him back in to the source of understanding, and he was once again able to put the facts together, find good in a matter, and speak and act kindly and positively. What's the lesson? When we are in turmoil and feel lacking in understanding, we are in good company. Many faithful servants of Jehovah have felt this way. When we do, like the psalmist, we hold back from negative speech, which can affect those around us. Instead, we speak privately with a trusted friend. We keep to our spiritual routine and we wait. We wait for our powerful moment, the realization that Jehovah God is the rock of our heart. And one final point, demonstrating understanding includes demonstrating it with ourselves. You will make mistakes. And when you do, your trust in Jehovah will allow you to find the good in yourself, as Brother Sanderson mentioned in the opening comments. And that will help you to keep a positive frame of mind. Well, we know Jehovah God is going to be with you in your assignments. May your trust in Him, the source of understanding, continue to deepen. This will allow you to address situations by putting the facts together, finding good in a matter, and speaking and acting kindly, positively, persuasively. When you do this, you'll be showing that you are wise in heart, and you will be called understanding.
Well, we thank you so much, Brother Morris, for that very, very encouraging talk. Well, now we're interested to hear from a helper with the writing committee, Brother Nicholas Aladis. His theme for us today is, There is a River.
Well, earthquakes have been in the news quite a bit recently, but we're going to read about an earthquake in Psalm 46, which describes one that has never happened in recorded history. Psalm 46, starting with verse 1. It says there, God is our refuge and strength, a help that is readily found in times of distress. That is why we will not fear, though the earth undergoes change, or some translations say, though the earth quakes, though the mountains topple into the depths of the sea, though its waters roar and foam over, though the mountains rock on account of its turbulence. Now, there's no evidence that this poetic description of mountains toppling into the sea literally happened in ancient Israel. But clearly, the world around the psalmist seemed to be collapsing somehow. What catastrophic situation is being referred to? Well, the Watchtower has explained that this psalm seems to fit the time of King Hezekiah, when Jerusalem was being threatened by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. Now, we know those threats were not empty. Sennacherib had conquered surrounding nations. He had also conquered the fortified cities around Jerusalem that were protecting the city. He had actually overrun the villages right up to Nob, and Nob was within sight of Jerusalem, 1 mile away. And as you know, Assyria was famous for its cruelty. They found palace walls from Sennacherib's time that show shocking scenes of brutality toward conquered peoples. So we can understand why the psalmist felt the world was collapsing. The description is so ominous and bleak. But suddenly in verse 4, the tone of the psalm changes completely. There is a river, the streams of which make the city of God rejoice, the holy grand tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the city. It cannot be overthrown. God will come to its aid at the break of dawn. So the psalmist's thoughts go from catastrophe and chaos to peace and confidence. And verse 4 speaks about a river in the city of God. There's no river flowing in Jerusalem, so what is this referring to? Well, some suggest that it refers to Hezekiah's tunnel that was built in order to bring water into the city. But the poetic structure of the psalm actually parallels the river to the holy tabernacle of Jehovah, the holy tabernacle of the Most High, and the pure worship carried on there. And it's interesting that when Hezekiah received the threats from Sennacherib, the scriptures say at 2 Kings 19 that Hezekiah took the letters from the Assyrians, he went into the temple, he spread them out before Jehovah, and he prayed fervently. And then Jehovah sent a reassuring message through Isaiah. I have heard your prayer to me concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria. He will not come into the city or shoot an arrow there or bring a shield or siege rampart against it. Now, the sons of Korah who recorded this psalm may have seen Hezekiah going into the temple and then heard Jehovah's response through Isaiah. And this would give them complete confidence in the outcome. And we all know what happened next. The huge Assyrian army was vanquished overnight by an angel. And it could be that verse 5 alludes to this, where it says, God will come to its aid at the break of dawn. But what does this psalm teach us? Well, the psalmist's example of focusing on pure worship and his word, which is likened to a river in this psalm, shows that we can experience peace even when the world around us seems to be collapsing. The psalmist declared, God is in the city. He was its ruler, not Sennacherib. For decades, Judah had been wayward, and God was not in Jerusalem. But Hezekiah renovated the temple and restored pure worship there. That pure worship was like a river of blessing that connected the people to Jehovah and gave powerful evidence that God was in the city. Our pure worship book associates the river of Psalm 46 with the river that flowed from Jehovah's sanctuary in Ezekiel's vision. And you might recall that that river became wider and deeper the further it flowed. And the pure worship book says about it, like the visionary river that Ezekiel saw, the flow of pure truths has expanded rapidly. And today the flow of that river includes Bible-based publications and videos in over 1,000 languages. Ezekiel said that the river got so deep that a person had to swim. And for the last 5 months, you students have felt like Ezekiel. Your course has immersed you and sometimes taken you underwater. And that was from the flood of Bible knowledge you received through your study, your lectures, and also the interaction with the students and also your instructors. And you may have felt like you were even drowning sometimes. But like Hezekiah and those with him, you've also been in the confines of a secure city where Jehovah's worship prevails. During these months, the world has been dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic and wars and other disasters. But you were like the psalmist. The earth could quake, the mountains could topple, but you enjoyed a special period of peace because you were focused on that river. Now you're going back out into the trenches with the rest of us, so to speak. Some of you will serve where there's economic turmoil, or violence, or other disasters. Or you may personally face health trials, even persecution. But the lesson of Gilead and the lesson of Psalm 46 can serve you well. When you stay focused on the river, Jehovah's pure worship, you can remain confident and joyful regardless of what challenges life brings. An ancient Greek writer said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." And isn't it true that our lives are constantly changing and new challenges suddenly crop up? But Jehovah's river of blessings just keeps flowing and is constantly renewed. It supplies life-giving water in all circumstances. And this is so even when the figurative mountains of this world are toppling and the world is in chaos. A sister in the war zone in eastern Ukraine wrote, "What we needed most was spiritual food. We were overwhelmed with joy when we received the JW boxes after the internet failed, and spiritual food became available again. Despite many challenges and difficulties, when we meet with fellow believers, our problems are not the main subject of discussion. More often, we share how Jehovah supports us, what has strengthened us, and what we're thankful for. We can sense her calmness. These friends are living examples of how focusing on the river can preserve our peace even in times of disaster." Now, returning to Psalm 46, we can paraphrase verses 8 and 9, which may have occurred when the angel destroyed the Assyrian army. It says, "Jehovah has done astonishing things in the earth, bringing an end to wars, breaking the bow and the spear, and burning the military wagons." We can just imagine the astonishing scene going out into the Assyrian camp and seeing the entire army devastated. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, we hate the war and violence that plagues this world and affects our dear brothers, and we long for it to end. But until then, understanding that Jehovah is still in the city, still in control with his people, gives us complete confidence. No humans, no attack of an Assyrian-like government can stop the flow of that river or shake the city. And the psalmist concludes in verse 11, with the reassuring echo of verse 1. "Jehovah of armies is with us. The God of Jacob is a secure refuge for us." Well, we don't know what your individual future holds after Gilead, what assignments you'll receive, but you can be confident that Jehovah is in the city. He's in control. And remember the lesson of Gilead. Stay focused on the river that makes the city of God rejoice, the river that will flow throughout eternity.
Thank you so much, Brother Elatus. That is absolutely one of my favorite scriptures and so reassuring during such challenging times. Well, now we're going to begin a series of 3 talks by instructors from the Gilead School. So first of all, we are going to start with Brother Trent Lippold, and his theme for us is the under-rower.
He is famously the object and not the subject of a Bible account. We easily sympathize with him because we can understand his emotions and feelings at the time. Yet, his response is that which provides a powerful life lesson in our service to God. We're introduced to him in the book of Mark, chapter 14. Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 50. Verse 50 picks up the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we read of the 11 faithful apostles, and they all abandoned him and fled. However, a certain young man, wearing only a fine linen garment over his naked body, began to follow him nearby, and they tried to seize him, but he left his linen garment behind and got away naked. The young man in this verse is understood to be John Mark. And notice John Mark's outstanding quality. When the apostles all fled, it says John Mark followed nearby. What tremendous courage of this young man. While the great men, the apostles, fled, Mark stayed, and he followed nearby. Now, interestingly, we know that Peter eventually also followed, but notice this about Peter in verse 54. But Peter from a good distance followed. John Mark followed nearby. In this, we see not only the courage of John Mark, but we also see his devotion to Jesus. To what extent he knew Jesus or had interactions with Jesus, we don't know. But he did have some, and his devotion and courage for his master is unquestionable here. The scriptures also describe John Mark, as a strengthening aid and a great comfort. Those were the observations of him later in his life. And we do know from the scriptures that John Mark worked in the background for some very big personalities: the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Peter, and Barnabas. John Mark initially caught the attention of the apostles, of Paul and Barnabas, when he was in Jerusalem. Paul, or Saul at the time, and Barnabas came there in 46 CE. And they took John Mark with them to the exciting assignment of Antioch, where Christianity was beginning to flourish, and John Mark was brought along with them. Later in the year 47, John Mark is selected to go with Barnabas and Saul on the first missionary tour. It's described for us in the book of Acts, chapter 13. In Acts chapter 13, in verses 4 and 5, it says, "So these men," that is Barnabas and Saul, "sent out by Holy Spirit, went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed away to Cyprus. When they arrived in Salamis, they began proclaiming the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews. They also had John as an attendant," John Mark. He is described here as an attendant. The footnote says an assistant. The writer of Acts used a very interesting word here for attendant, and it's a Greek word that literally means an under-rower. An under-rower was a man who worked below the decks on a large Roman naval vessel. He would be below deck. He would have to row in unison, in cooperation with his fellow rowers, and he would have to follow the pace set by the captain. Why would this term be used for John Mark in this instance? Well, the clue comes from verse 4, where it says they sailed away to Cyprus. So the metaphor of an under-rower now takes on greater meaning. Incidentally, the same term is used by the Apostle Paul when he refers to himself as a servant of God or an attendant in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Why would that be significant? Why use it in 1 Corinthians? Because in one of the bays next to Corinth, the large ships of the Roman Navy took port there. And so again, the metaphor of the under-rower would take on great meaning. Well, the infamous event occurred in Acts chapter 15, the event which John Mark was an object of. Notice in Acts chapter 15, beginning in verse 37, it says, "Barnabas was determined to take along John, who was called Mark. Paul, however, was not in favor of taking him along with them, seeing that he had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. At this there was a sharp burst of anger, so that they separated from each other, and Barnabas took Mark along and sailed away to Cyprus." Denied an opportunity, denied a privilege. What does Mark do? it says he sailed away with Barnabas to Cyprus. Mark kept active in Jehovah's service. How does he do that? John Mark was not so concerned about a lost privilege that he failed to appreciate the opportunities that were in front of him. Well, while he's sailing away and working, what's Paul doing? Verse 40 and 41 say Paul selected Silas. 41 says he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the congregations. Now, as you carry on in chapter 16, we find him arriving in Derbe, in Lystra. And verse 1 says he met Timothy, a disciple. Verse 3, what happens? Paul expressed a desire for Timothy to join him. Mark's replacement. Interestingly, as Paul now begins to travel with Timothy, we find that the Apostle Paul writes to the Thessalonians within a year. And in 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 1, Paul's greeting is from Paul, Silas, and Timothy. 2 Thessalonians 2, from Paul, Silas, and Timothy. I wonder how Mark's feeling at this point. 5 years later, he writes to the Corinthians, and again, now it's from Paul and Timothy. During all this time where Timothy is rising, what's Mark doing? He's rowing. Mark is continually faithfully serving Jehovah. 11 years later, in the year 60 to 61, when Paul was in Rome, who was with him? John Mark. And when Paul wrote letters to various congregations, he describes John Mark. In fact, in one of the letters in sending greetings, this is in Colossians, he makes reference to the fact that he had wanted to send John Mark as a personal representative to the congregations. And that indicates to us what kind of man Mark was and what reputation he had. A personal representative was someone who was deeply trusted, and he would have to represent Paul before the congregations that he would visit. That is the reputation of John Mark. You know, there's no record in the scriptures of the challenges that John Mark faced in his ministry. There's no shipwrecks, no beatings, no hunger, no left for dead for John Mark. But there is one challenge that he faced that is shared with us. And that is his difficulty or the challenge with the Apostle Paul, his brother. And yet clearly, there were no hard feelings between these two men, even though there was a difference. In fact, Paul's final words chronologically in the book of 2 Timothy chapter 4, in reference to John Mark, he tells Timothy, bring Mark, he's helpful. The under-rower, John Mark. Interestingly, for all that we know about Timothy, there are no words recorded of Timothy's in the scriptures. And yet, John Mark wrote a gospel. And as a typical under-rower, he never mentioned his name. So when we put the pieces together of what is shared of John Mark in the scriptures, we get a portrait of a man who was, one, zealous for promoting the good news in the worldwide field, and two, happy to serve others. This alone is worthy of our imitation. But there is more. In your future, you may be the object caught up in a Paul and Barnabas moment. You may face changed circumstances due to health or family issues. You may be the one who has to work in the shadow of a Timothy. A door may close for you or be closed for you. But like Mark, do not be so concerned about lost privileges that you fail to appreciate the opportunities that are right in front of you. May you, like Mark, keep your heart and your hands strong. Keep them on the oars. Work in unison. Cooperate with your brothers and sisters for the Master. May you, like Mark, be the under-rower.
Thank you so much, Brother Lippold, for that very practical counsel. Well, now we hear from another one of the instructors of the Gilead School, Brother Richard Chilton, and his theme for us today is, "Where you go, I will go."
What do the following have in common? Build an ark, choose 300 men, march around the city 7 times, follow this route to the Red Sea. Did you figure it out? Jehovah was providing his people with direction. And in the case of these examples, sometimes that direction could appear to be, let's say, a bit unusual. It's not too hard for us to imagine Noah responding, "And you want me to build a massive ark?" Or Gideon asking, "Just 300 men against an army of 135,000? Are you sure?" Or Joshua replying, "March around Jericho 7 times and just blow our horns? That's it?" Or Moses saying, "Why are we headed to the Red Sea when I believe there is a much more direct route to the Promised Land?" They all could have responded in such ways. But did they? Let's allow the Bible to help us find the answer. Genesis chapter 6. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 22, we find that Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. He did just so. In fact, in the examples we've mentioned, they all did just so. The direction might not have been what they expected, but they humbly made the mental turn, so to speak, and they followed the divine guidance wherever it was taking them. And because they did, they saved not only themselves, but all those that were with them. Clearly, the one leading them was Jehovah. And by their responsive actions, they were in effect saying to him, "Where you go, I will go." Well, what about you, dear graduates, here before us today? Like those faithful ones of old, you are not alone in navigating your way. Jehovah is where he has always been, at the helm, guiding his people. The only difference is, today, Jehovah is providing direction through his faithful and discreet slave. And it is due to our limited understanding that at times the direction may appear to be a bit unusual. Nonetheless, you have followed that direction, no matter what it was, no matter where it was taking you. And for that, we want to say thank you. In fact, we want to thank all of you in our listening audience for being responsive toward the direction provided. But we thank especially you, dear Gilead graduates before us today. Now, why? Because during the 5 months that we have spent with you, we saw you. We saw how you closely followed the direction of the faithful slave. You did just so. For example, when presenting your student assignments, you did so in English, even though for most of you, that was not your mother tongue. And when COVID protocols were set in place, we saw you follow all of them, even though they might have been inconvenient, in order to keep you and your classmates healthy. And when you were given counsel, not only from your instructors, but from each other, you expressed gratitude for it and immediately went to work at applying it. We saw you grow in your love for one another, for God's organization, for Jehovah, and for his son Jesus. all of this was a direct result of your sensitivity to the direction of the faithful slave. But what about after you leave this place? Even if you are assigned back to the country of origin, you won't be the same person that left. And things may not be the way you remember them either. However, we have full confidence that whatever future changes come your way, you will continue echoing the sentiments of the Moabitess Ruth. Recall when she was faced with numerous intimidating changes, what she said to Naomi. Her words are recorded for us in Ruth chapter 1, the book bearing her name, verse 16 and 17. Ruth said, "Do not plead with me to abandon you, to turn back from accompanying you. For where you go, I will go. And where you spend the night, I will spend the night. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Jehovah do so to me and add to it if anything but death should separate me from you." Now, what did all of this actually mean for Ruth? It meant leaving what was familiar to her. It meant adopting a people with beliefs different from hers. It meant following customs that could result in her becoming the wife of someone she did not choose or did not even know, for that matter. It meant never returning to what she had left behind. When Ruth said to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go," she meant with no clauses, no exceptions, no bargaining. It was without question. For Ruth, these were not just words. It was her mindset. It was the same mindset that Noah, Gideon, Joshua, and Moses had. And like them, if we endeavor to always see the one behind the direction, we will be able to move in heart harmony with the chariot. Not under it, not behind it, right alongside it. In fact, this thought brings back to my mind a fond memory. I recall when my wife and I lived in South Africa, I once observed a flock of birds in motion. What species, I do not know, but I'm sure they numbered into the thousands. And as they swirled and turned as a group in unison, it was a beautiful, magnificent sight to behold. What's interesting is that scientists think that each bird focuses not on the entire flock, but on just a few of its most nearest neighbors in flight. When those near them turn, they turn. Each one does this, creating a sort of harmonious wave effect. Well, in a similar way, when we display by our speech and actions the mindset, "Jehovah, where you and your slave go, I will go," we motivate others near us to do the same. When a change in theocratic direction comes and we make the turn, then our spiritual brothers and sisters make the turn with us. And when Jehovah's people turn in sync, in mid-flight, so to speak, it is a beautiful thing in the eyes of Jehovah. Just as Noah, Gideon, Joshua, Moses, and Ruth set the pattern for all of us, now, dear graduates, it is your turn to set the pattern for others. As you continue to follow closely the direction provided by Jehovah through his faithful slave, others will see his blessing upon you. They will see how he is keeping you safe and secure. They will see your joy and contentment. And out of a keen desire to have that same experience, they too will be motivated to say, "Where you go, I will go."
Thank you so much, Brother Chilton. Very, very practical advice for the students and for all of us. We appreciate it so much. Well, we'll hear now from the third and final instructor from the Gilead School, Brother James Cawthon, and his theme for us today is Counselor or Shepherd?
Which has greater appeal, an effective counselor or a loving shepherd? If you're to be effective, brothers and sisters, in strengthening the organization and building up the brotherhood, it's a good subject to consider, and it includes you sisters too. A counselor can be defined as one who gives advice. Now, the world has a lot of counselors. They've got marriage counselors and financial counselors and bereavement counselors and all kinds of counselors. And you'll find that their counsel varies according to their experience and education. Ahithophel is a biblical example of a counselor, and the Bible says what he advised was considered as the word of the true God. Today, a person might feel that he's a good counselor, and he may freely offer advice, some of which may or may not be accepted. Maybe a solution-oriented husband counsels his emotionally distraught wife to just quit worrying. Or a well-versed elder quickly reads a Bible text and he advises an extreme and anxiety-filled publisher to just get over it. How effective is such counsel? There's a saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Counsel is more effective when the counselor is also a shepherd. A shepherd is one who comforts, nourishes, listens, and does not ignore the emotional needs of the distraught one. Jehovah gives counsel or advice, but he always does more. You see, he also shepherds. When he counsels, he tends to the person's emotional needs, and he provides the needed follow-up. Consider how he dealt with an emotionally depressed prophet by the name of Elijah. I'm turning to 1 Kings 19, and we're going to consider just briefly the interaction he had with Elijah. And you will recall that he was driven by fear. Elijah was driven by fear of Jezebel. Elijah fled southward for 95 miles to Beersheba, and then he walked for about another 200 miles to Mount Horeb. But now notice in verse 5, it says, "Then he," that is Elijah, "lay down and fell asleep under the broom tree. But suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, 'Get up and eat.' When he looked, there at his head was a round loaf on heated stones and a jug of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. Later the angel of Jehovah came back a second time and touched him and said, 'Get up and eat, for the journey will be too much for you.' So he got up and ate and drank, and in the strength of that nourishment, he went on for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of the true God." You notice the angel awakened Elijah, ministered to him, and Elijah went back to sleep like depressed ones often do. Maybe the angel waited all night and he touched Elijah again and then gave him more nourishment. Nourishment such as would take him 40 days and 40 nights on his journey to Mount Horeb. Now, here's a question you have to ask yourself. Do you think that that angel agreed with the way Elijah was acting? Do you think the angel might have wanted to give a little counsel and tell Elijah, look, Elijah, just get over it. Just trust God and get back to your assignment. But he didn't. Do you think Jehovah knew how Elijah was thinking? Do you think he agreed with it? No, definitely not. See, a counselor may have handled it one way, but Jehovah, the God of all comfort, would first address Elijah's emotional needs. So when Elijah finally entered the cave at Mount Horeb, remember what Jehovah did? In a calm, low voice, gentle voice, he said, Elijah, what is your business here? And that was a warm invitation for Elijah to express himself. Just talk to me, you see. And so Elijah did. Look at verse 10. And see, what was it Elijah said? He said, I have been absolutely zealous for Jehovah, the God of armies, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. So Elijah felt like his work was in vain. And then he said, I'm the only one left. Elijah felt alone. And he said, they are seeking to take me away, take my life away. So Elijah was also afraid. Well, Jehovah heard what he said, and he addressed all of Elijah's concern. And then afterwards, he gave Elijah the encouragement that would allow him to continue on in Jehovah's service with boldness. So what can we learn from this brief experience? Well, we learn that Jehovah validated the man's emotions without agreeing with his thinking. And we also learn that it's often not necessary to offer a quick solution. Simply allowing a person to express themselves without feeling judged can bring tremendous relief. In fact, friends, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, it's indistinguishable. Like Jehovah, we'll be more effective if we're patient shepherds that listen and give thoughtful consideration to the feelings of those that we're seeking to help. So here are 4 takeaway points, okay? Number 1, be a listener, not a lecturer. Show empathy. And remember, empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, hearing with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. It's easy, friends, for imperfect humans to take themselves too seriously, especially when they're given a position of responsibility. So at times, it may even be best to refrain from offering counsel too soon, because that creates an air of superiority. Conversely, a willingness to hear even wild talk from another will reveal the depth of our own humility. Point number 2, validate people's emotions and don't just dismiss them. Feelings are real, so know the difference between validating and invalidating statements. I can see why you would feel that way. That must be really hard. You see, when we listen with empathy, what we're really saying is, you matter to me, that you're important, and I care how you feel. Additionally, when you validate the other person, they become significantly more likely to listen to advice or counsel later. Remember, there is a difference between, and by the way, let me just say this. Counsel is not necessarily good just because it's accurate. Frankly, how you give it and when you give it is important. So try to remember that. Just because it's accurate doesn't make it good. And there's a difference, too, between validating and devastating. You know, you're too sensitive. What's the big deal? I don't want to hear it. I don't have time for this. You need to work on your spirituality. Now, although we may not mean it, this can translate into you're not important, your feelings aren't important, and frankly, I don't really care. Point number 3, acknowledge the vulnerability. Sharing personal thoughts and emotions can be difficult, uncomfortable, and even scary. But I think that we're encouraged to develop fellow feeling. And finally, point number 4, offering counsel is entirely optional. How many of us brothers have been on a shepherding call and we've said virtually nothing, and the publisher, the brother or sister afterward says, you know what, that was the best shepherding call I ever had. So what some may need is not some solution for the problem, but simply to talk to a good listener, someone who will not tell them how they're supposed to feel, but will listen without being judgmental. The saying is, friends, time is life. If we won't give a brother our time, do you really think we would give our life for him? So when we show favor to the lowly one by giving him time and attention, we are in fact lending to Jehovah, and the Bible says that he will repay us in our time of need. So weave counsel and shepherding together, and you'll be treasured by all those around you, and most of all, by Jehovah God and Jesus Christ.
Thank you so much, Brother Cawthon, for that very wise and practical counsel. I'm sure elders all around the world will benefit so much from hearing that talk when it goes up on JW Broadcasting.
We hope you enjoyed part 1 of the graduation. Parts 2 and 3 will be available on jw.org later this month. Before we conclude, let's visit the island of Greenland. It's the world's largest island. What picture comes to your mind? White sandy beaches, warm sunny weather? No. Greenland is among the closest countries to the North Pole and is almost entirely covered by ice. The northern lights dance on the night sky. Arctic foxes and polar bears roam the tundra. And icebergs dot the turquoise waters of the fjords. Greenland is the birthplace of the kayak, as Eskimo hunters needed a narrow vessel to navigate these icy waterways. Most locals travel by boat since roadways are limited. Our brothers and sisters use their boats to reach remote communities scattered around the island. The preachers of God's Word in Greenland have a rich history of using inventive transportation. The first publishers on the island, Kirsten Lauritsen and Arne Yellem, even used dog sleds to complete their 1,600-kilometer or 1,000-mile preaching tour. Today, publishers here are still resourceful. They find interested ones in businesses, at fishing docks, and through telephone witnessing. The Greenlandic language can be complex with its long, multisyllabic words. Yet great care is taken to translate publications and videos for the 57,000 who speak the language. On October 30th, 2021, the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures was released in Greenlandic, a delight for those on the island who love God's Word. All 120 publishers of Greenland send their warm love and greetings to the worldwide brotherhood. From the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses, this is JW Broadcasting.